I hope you've enjoyed your lunch. And once again, my name is Stephanie Gadwa, and on behalf of the entire team at the Economic Club of Canada, thank you for joining us today. Now, before we begin, we are reminded and we respectfully acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory and home of Indigenous people. The Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunees, the Chippewas, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, land steeped in a really rich history dating back many generations. The purpose of our acknowledgement today is to show our gratitude and our respect for their contributions and to recognize the role of treaty making in what is now Toronto. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Economic Club, we are one of Canada's national podiums of record and one of the only nonpartisan national public policy platforms that unite leaders, innovators, and experts from different industries to discuss and address key issues shaping the future of our country. Our foundation is firmly Canadian, but our influence spans well beyond our borders. Our commitment to fostering collaboration and promoting thoughtful debate continues to drive so much of the work that we do. Now, we know events like this one would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. So a big thank you to our title sponsor today, Organigram, and thank you to our community partners, Budtenders Association, and our media partner today is StratCan. Canada's legal cannabis industry has rapidly grown into one of the country's most significant agricultural and export opportunities, with the potential to play an even larger role in driving economic growth, trade, and global competitiveness. Today, we're so pleased to welcome James Yamanaka, President and CEO of Organigram, for a conversation on the future of the sector, the policy choices shaping the trajectory, and how Canada can strengthen its leadership position in an evolving international market. Here to moderate the conversation is Jameson Burkow from the Globe and Mail. Let's give them a warm welcome.
Just to say, we are taking questions from the audience. That's what this little iPad is for. It's empty right now, so if y'all could do my job for me a little better, appreciate it. James, thanks for sitting down with me.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump right off with the most controversial question I could think of and put you right in the hot seat. You've lived all over the world. Where is winter worse? Or is it Northern Europe, where I know you lived for a number of years, or is it here?
You know, I think the honest answer, and this is not just because I'm in Toronto, it is actually worse in Northern Europe. And it's not because it's colder, it's the dark. It's the dark. You know, if you're there in the middle of December, you know, sun's up at 10:30, down by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it kind of, at noon, it's there. It does this little thing. So as cold as it was here, it's better. Yeah?
Well, won't be opening a satellite office in Alaska anytime soon, I guess.
And thanks for the payment, Toronto Board of,
Yeah, Board of Tourism is it's just going to have the burlap sack with the dollar sign on it, leave it outside your office door. Your background with BAT, British American Tobacco, I find that really fascinating because for so many years, and arguably still, Canada's cannabis industry has tried to really overtly distance itself from big tobacco. So do you think that was a mistake? Like, were they ignoring the lessons they could have learned from an industry that's gone through so many similar struggles over not even decades, centuries?
No, honestly, I don't think so. I think, you know, they're similar. I've worked in, you know, that industry for a long time. They are very, you know, very similar in some ways operationally, but I think from, you know, what the product is, the impact of the product is quite different. I think also, you know, what you would learn from a regulatory situation from the old tobacco industry is very different from cannabis. You know, you've got to remember there's 3 players. So with all the excise and everything that happens in that space, you know, there's pricing power, there's all those sorts of things. So trying to do the exact same thing in this space, I don't think would have worked. And I do think there's a good reason to kind of separate them. There's similar issues, health issues, the Health Canada sorts of things, but I do think they're different enough from a regulatory and policy perspective. You need to treat them differently. The economics are just different. You know, regulating an industry with 600 players versus 3, it's a very different game. Yeah.
So what is there to learn, though, from that extensive background you have with tobacco that you think will help propel the cannabis industry forward? Because I think it's relatively fair to say, and the folks in this room probably know better than most across the country, that there has been a big drop-off in just overall general awareness of the fact that the cannabis industry even exists.
Yeah.
And we're less than a decade into it.
I think there's a few learnings I would take from where I came from to the cannabis industry. I think one, from a regulatory perspective, if you focus too much on regulating again, trying to kill an industry, which is essentially what the goal was in that side, you get to a sort of tipping point. I think I don't mind regulation. There's good regulation. I mean, there are legitimate issues with products that are there, and I think good behavior is something that the players need to do. I mean, I think we have a responsibility as one of the leaders, along with the other big cannabis companies, to do it the right way. And I think from a policy point, there's always a tipping point where things like excise, things like excessive regulations, it reaches a point where all you do is spark illicit. Do you know what I mean? And I think you just need to get that balance right. And I think, if you look at some place like Australia right now, where they really kind of went crazy on excise and over-regulation on cigarettes, you actually have a growing market of smokers there. And it's all illegal. So there's always a balance. I think there's good regulation that should be in place, that we should be in favor of, along with other companies. I think, if that regulation is a reasonable, taxation's at a reasonable level, and you enable companies to be able to reinvest in it, that's fine. I don't have an issue with that. You can always go over a tipping point there where all you do is you fuel illicit products, and you fuel all the things that I think part of the goal initially when you legalize cannabis you wanted to have happen, stop happening if you overdo it. Yeah.
One could argue that that's exactly what Canada has done, at least from a government regulatory perspective, and yet the public awareness of that is just not there, right? So ultimately, how do you incentivize the government to, because from the perspective right now, it's almost like, worst case scenario, the legal industry, totally topples because it cracks under the weight of all these regulations. If there's no sort of public outcry to that, then the government's not going to be motivated to, lift a regulatory or legislative finger about it. So how do you change that?
Look, I think a lot of it is really about reframing the debate. So if you take the cannabis industry out of the equation, right? This is an industry that employs now probably close to 250,000 people. If you look at the GDP contribution, all in with all the, the other companies that are related, it's about $16 billion. Direct GDP contribution is about $8 billion. We, the Canadian companies are the biggest exporters to the world. I was in Germany a few weeks ago for a conference in ICBC, and Canadian companies dominate the event. Because it was federally legal here, you have the best companies in the world. The US companies are restricted from doing it, so Canada actually is the lead player. You are, 46% of the exports to Germany, which is the biggest growth market, come from Canadian companies. And if you add in sort of the product that goes through Portugal and into, you're probably at 60%. Wow. What industry does Canada have where it is the world leader? It is the biggest exporter. If you're going to be in this business, you have to talk to Canadian companies. Then if you look at it that way, then there should be an outcry for policies that enable the companies to operate better, to invest. Because for us personally, I'd love to invest more. We can't meet demand, but with some of the regulatory situations, the excise rates, you're always struggling for those funds to invest. And if you look across all the big companies, right, we make money, but it's marginal. And it's not about saying, take all the taxes away, make it free for us, but set up a system that encourages it, not just taxation, but regulatory policy, trade support, even things like just harmonizing testing across the two markets. There's a lot of things that can be done, and I think it's about framing it in that way. This is an industry where you can grow the economy, you can export more, and Canada should be the leader. Yeah.
I think actually a point that you raised there bears repeating. Just the sheer size of this industry, I think, frankly, shocks people. You're talking about a quarter of a million jobs. Yeah. Compare that to you were talking about, you have to talk to Canadian companies if you're in this industry. Look at the oil sands. Look at heavy oil, one of Canada's premier, for better or worse, most well-known industries. They employ about 200,000 people. Yeah. Add indirect jobs, we're talking about 500,000, which is only skirting double the role of cannabis. But you ask the average Canadian on the street, they're much more likely to know about one industry versus the other and where it stands in the Canadian economy. So kind of two questions, I guess, there is, how do we make Canadians aware of the economic contributions of the legal cannabis industry and why it makes sense to continue making these inroads and to eventually obliterating, of course, the goal of the illicit market. And the other one is how much bigger can it get? Is it saturated in terms of its economic contributions? Can it, are we going to be having this conversation 10, 15, 20 years from now where there are more people directly or indirectly employed in cannabis than there are in the oil sands?
Yeah.
Maybe because one industry is doing this, the other one's doing that.
Yeah.
So who's to say? But
Yeah.
what do you see there?
Well, look, I think to the first question about how do you make it more aware, I mean, events like this help. But I think, as well, the industry is not one that is very organized at the moment. There's no real strong industry association to promote sort of the economic benefits. And I think, again, it's about, you can be very, as an industry or an industry player, you can be very, very much navel-gazing and talk about your specific needs, or you can talk about it in the framework of the economy. So I think it's the job of the industry, and not just Organigram. We want to play a role in that, but I think the rest of the industry needs to as well to be able to do that and really emphasize. And by the way, I think in my sort of 4.5 months I've been here, the provinces are quite aware of it. You talk to the New Brunswick authorities, and I actually had a call with Premier Holt the other day. I mean, they are very aware, because in New Brunswick we are a significant employer. Even in sort of agricultural cash receipts, we're actually bigger than potatoes. So it's a significant contributor. And then when you think going forward, is there growth in the industry? I think there's enormous growth out there. The Canadian market is no longer growing at double-digit growth rates as it was. You had the boom, the bust, and now I think it's settled and you're at a good, solid growth rate. A few percent, like most industries, you're not at the 10, 20%. But there is still growth in Canada, and I think we'll continue to play that role as Organigram here. But the export opportunity is enormous. You have the biggest markets now are Germany, Australia, UK. If you look at the German market, where I think we now have a company there, Sanity, that we've merged with, that market today is already about 2.5 billion euros, growing at double-digit rates. We think in 2 years it'll be at least 4.5 billion. And to give you the reason why I think there's such an opportunity there, this is medical cannabis in Germany. This is a country with a population of 84 million people. You have, I think, 70 million adults, 56 million people above the age of 40 who would use it for medical purposes. With that $2.5 billion today, there are 800,000 registered patients.
Whoa.
So, so it's a tiny, tiny proportion of people who, once they know the industry and would use it for medical purposes, that growth that I'm saying to 4.5 billion gets you to about 1.8 million patients.
Yeah.
Out of a over 40 population of 56 million people. So the growth potential, and that's one market, right? Yeah. So similar size in the UK, Australia, smaller size in terms of potential, but you're slowly getting openings in Poland and in Switzerland, which would be small but huge margin. So if anything, I think the biggest issue a lot of us are going to face is capacity to do it at a medical grade, which is a challenge. Yeah.
I was curious, why do you use the over 40 figure?
No, I do, because in Europe, I use it mostly because in Europe it really is a medical market.
Yeah.
And I would assume it's adults.
People in their 30s get sick too.
You can use 70, right? It's 70 million people
Sure.
who are adults. So yes, I can use the 70 million. I use the higher number just because a lot of it, and a lot of the use in Europe and in where it started was for people for pain relief, for all those sorts of things. So it's an audience where you could get more entry. I think you'll get it, at different adult ages. It was just sort of a number I picked out, because it is medical there, and you do have some propensity of
Sure.
older people to, people.
Not a lot of 32-year-olds with arthritis.
People still younger than me, but older generally in a population. Yeah.
Let's talk more about the international opportunity there, because I find it very fascinating, and you touched on that when you said, if you want to do business internationally, you have to talk to Canadian companies, but it's actually a much more competitive landscape out there, even now, than it was just a few years ago. Like I didn't realize in preparing for this conversation that Thailand is playing such a huge role now. I mean, maybe just give us a bit of a broad overlay of like what the international competitive landscape in cannabis looks like now, given that you talk about the domestic barriers to growth, the international barriers are exponentially larger.
Yeah. Look, I hadn't, from my original comment that you have to talk to Canadian companies, Canadian companies still have a multi-year lead on any other producer in the world, and the U.S. companies are restricted from doing exports because of the regulatory situation there. And I think, one of the biggest dangers, to your point, is that Canada lets an industry where it leads in to slip. And it's much harder to do this well than people think, right? When you're selling medical, I mean, these are clean rooms. You essentially have to do it from start to finish to get to EU GMP in a very, very, very difficult way. We struggle with it sometimes. All the companies do. But at the same time, I think the threat over the next couple of years is countries like Thailand or South Africa or Colombia or lots of other places where the local governments are starting to see the potential for exports to Europe. In Thailand, actually Borna sitting right there, went over to look at some of the facilities in Thailand, and we expected a sort of pretty, basic industry. And there are, say 400, 500 people who grow there, and most of it is exactly that, nowhere near grade that you would be able to export. But you do find, 6, 7, 8 companies that are very well funded. If you go to our Moncton facility, it's a great indoor facility, sort of flagship.
Yeah, it's very cool.
They are building these, and they exist. These are indoor facilities.
And they're strictly for export.
100% for export. So I think the Thai government, you never know.
Yeah.
And on the domestic Thai front, I think you're always going to have ups and downs, but there is a good level of commitment from the Thai government to support exports as a product. And then obviously for a Canadian company, it'll take them some years to catch up, but if they do, they have the advantage of labor costs. That will always play in, and then Europe will be a playground for them if they can get it right. But like I said, it's not panic, but it'll come, and if we don't have the funds to invest, to automate, to expand, and to keep those advantages, the Canadian companies will lose it. Yeah.
So despite all the hands tied, 6 hands tied behind your back and all that, you are managing to forge ahead. Of course, you mentioned the German deal that just got wrapped up and the expansion in Australia. This is all happening with almost the opposite of government support, right? Like there's no EDC has no involvement in anything you do. You're getting no help from the Trade Commissioner Service that is chomping at the bit, especially in the current political environment, to help Canadian companies expand abroad. So what difference would it make if all of a sudden those resources did become available to you?
Yeah, look, I think, first of all, I'd say I'd have a little balance. They're not helping as much as they should. There's not, I wouldn't say there's no help. I have spoken to different people, and there is a willingness to help, particularly on the export front. It's probably not there yet. The things that could really help is, like I said, if you frame it as an economic export engine rather than cannabis, you can be part of the normal trade missions, which we're not today. You could have action on things like easing exports. Like we have to, every shipment has to have a permit. Which means you have delays and you have to do it over and over and over. You can make it much simpler by having, especially, trusted parties, have a license. You can fix that.
Literally the same thing
exactly. It's
happening
the same
over
thing.
and over again.
So you don't have to go through that bureaucracy. And I think, and beyond that, there are things, that you get in other trade areas where you agree standards of testing and protocols and mutual recognition of a test done here is the same test you do there. All those things would make it much, much easier for all the Canadian companies and to keep that lead, because you do have just bureaucracy steps along the way that are costly, and these are perishable products too, right? So anytime it's sitting out there, the older it gets, the less value after a certain period.
It's
right?
not Scotch.
No. If it was, it'd be nice, because then you wouldn't have to worry about out of dates and things like that.
Well, then you also get the prestige factor of most members of Congress in the U.S. would actually maybe be on side with this, given what I've seen in their back offices. One thing that speaking of members of Congress, speaking of the United States, that's, famously described as, in bed with an elephant, everything that happens in the U.S. I mean, there's a big reason why so many cannabis companies, like yours, is not listed on the TSX and can't be, at least right now.
And we are.
Or I mean, initially,
Yeah,
I meant,
yeah.
and the challenges of why so many cannabis companies are still on the CSE instead. The rules in the U.S. are so complicated.
Yeah.
I think there was, and we were talking about this while we were having lunch, that the descheduling in the U.S. was really, I think, expected to be this big watershed moment that wasn't. Mm-hmm. And at what point is there going to be opportunity for Canadian companies in the U.S.? Because I think a big part of the bottom falling out of the cannabis market during the sort of heyday of the public markets in cannabis was this expectation of being able to pivot into the U.S. and really dramatically expand. Nobody's expecting that anymore, and even with this descheduling, there's still, that was a very anticlimactic experience, I think, for a lot of people. What does the American market look like to you? Is it just a maybe one day it'll be nice if kind of thing, or is there a realistic business strategic plan to put in place to capitalize on that?
Yeah, I think, look, it is the biggest market in the world by a long way, and it's for any cannabis company. I don't think you can ignore the potential in the U.S. At the same time, to your point, it's incredibly difficult for a Canadian player, particularly one listed on the NASDAQ and TSX, to do this, because even though you had rescheduling, it could potentially help the CBD players and those sorts of players with some of the descheduling. But as long as it's not federally legal, you run into all the problems of the banking system. If we wanted, it's not that we couldn't do something there. We'd have to set up entirely different legal structures, some arm length things that would make it a very complicated model to work. I'm not saying we wouldn't do it. I mean, we'll continue to look at to see if it makes sense. The second thing is, although you had the rescheduling, at the same time, what you had is a change to the Farm Bill, which enabled all the drinks which are hemp-derived THC in the market, and that was federally legal. So, our investment in Collective Project, which is a drinks company that was hemp-derived THC, was federally legal, so we could do it. Mm-hmm. At the same time, they are rescheduling. They made that illegal. Well, it's not illegal yet. It's still it's still working, but I think unless something happens quickly, it'll become illegal at a federal level again, which would create the same problem for us. And you'll go back to the state-by-state operators doing it rather than the Canadian players. So, of course, you're interested, and we're going to continue to watch. If there's an opportunity, we'll go after it. But it's not a quick call. And I think, look, from an Organigram specific, it's not cheap to invest in the U.S. either,
no.
Right? So I think we have such good opportunities in Europe, Germany first, but also Switzerland, Poland, UK, things like that, where I think we have a much better chance of a quick ROI. That, my priority is there now. U.S. is a big priority because of its size, but we really need something to change before you would make a big investment. Yeah.
That's interesting about the Farm Bill, because you talked earlier about the lack of like a coherent sort of industry voice in Canada that's able to lobby governments effectively. That certainly exists in the United States, right? Yeah. There's plenty of lobbyists doing that, and yet, one would have imagined that their whole raison d'etre was to stop something like that Farm Bill change from happening, and yet they were still able to open one window and close another.
Yeah.
So, what are the odds that this eventually gets resolved and that America actually legalizes cannabis federally? I mean, it seems like low-hanging political fruit to...
Yeah. Well, I think anyone who wants to take a bet on American politics at the moment is a brave person.
That's fair.
But at the same time, I think what's happened recently is in the Farm Bill, I think it was one or two pretty powerful senators who were very against this. And
they can't be alive that much longer, though. I mean,
yeah, probably not. But
like late mid '80s now.
Look, I do think on the THC, I mean the hemp-based drinks, I do think you'll have movement. Maybe not this year. I think there's enough support and the business is big enough in the U.S. that I think it will eventually happen. Federal legalization is anybody's guess. There's plenty of lobbies going in, speaking to the government at different levels. You have competing lobbies in the same space. You have, the medical CBD sort of space lobbyists. You have the THC, the drinks lobbyists, and by the way, you also have the traditional beverage companies, alcohol companies, who may or may not always be aligned with what the cannabis industry drinks would want to do. So I think it will continue on. Like I said, I'm much more optimistic that the space that we're currently in could reopen, sort of the hemp-derived drinks. Federal legalization, I think we'll see, and with all the things going around, I mean, trying to get something at the top of the agenda in the U.S., I think, is everybody's challenge.
Sure. I mean, it could happen literally in the process of this conversation. We could get out of it and find that was just something that is another executive order that nobody expected.
And that's your problem, too. When it's all executive orders, you don't know if there's any certainty.
Right.
You could always get turned around the next day, so, you're always more comfortable. It's a law and sort of a, quite frankly, a competent agency to regulate it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you can count those on one hand, I'd be impressed. If you could fill the hand, I should say. So more broadly internationally, in terms of the export opportunity, you noted that several countries are either relaxing their regulations, expanding into medical. Given the evolutionary path that we're seeing globally, how big an export opportunity can this become for Canada in the next 3, 5, maybe 10 years? I mean, 10 years is a long time in this market. Look where we were 10 years ago. Is this something where, we can, like Thailand, build a industry that is primarily export focused?
Yes, I do think so. If you look at the numbers today, so exports from Canada are, I think, something like $570 million. And that's based on the number I told you about Germany.
Yeah.
Right. You double Germany itself. That's you get to $1 billion pretty quickly. You add in the UK, you're at and if it changes, you can get well into the multiple billions depending how it plays out. Like I said, Germany, you don't need to make big assumptions to see it being big enough just by itself to, from that 560 to get to 2 billion is not at all out of reach. And when you have markets the size of Poland, big population, UK, you very quickly get to some very big numbers. And I think over time too, I think the good thing with us in the Sanity Group there is you have the team that has joined us there. It's probably one of the best known in the market in Europe, and I think they a lot of it is about explaining, the right way to legalize, the right way to get it done. And I think, Finn, who sort of leads the business there, and others, I think we have a good coalition to kind of push it forward in the right way. But I think as an industry there is a huge export opportunity for Canada. It's all about investing now to make sure we're ready for it. And to make sure that we don't lose that lead that the country has. As much as Thailand's impressive, the numbers are tiny.
Right.
Right. So, like I said,
you
it's
said
not
like
the
6,
sky.
7, 8 companies maybe.
Yeah, and the volumes, the capacity they have are still very small, and they'll run into the same kind of problems. The Canadian companies had all the problems with, all of manufacturing at sort of a medical grade level, and I think
we've had all our problems already.
Yeah, and they're
sure.
they're learning from us, but it's not easy, and you run into all the strange things. It's a humid place. Microbials grow in humid places.
Sure.
So there's a lot of structural things you're going to have to work through, and they'll probably need our help. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised you see Canadian companies going there, consulting them on how to do it better. So it's still the business. It's just a different business. Yeah.
Could one of those companies be Organigram?
Could be. I mean, look, at the moment, no. But certainly you'd look at partnerships and things to diversify. You never want to be single source, but I think the first option is to get our own supply right and make sure that we can build up, invest. Probably for us it means Moncton, where the big facility is, to really make sure we get real certainty of supply and the right quality. Medical markets, it has to be very, very consistent, and I think we have a fantastic facility and great people there to do that. Yeah.
I should say on that point, just and as much as I wish Organigram had given me a big bag of money to say this. I am saying this just out of my own free will, that in 2019, I had one of the most fun experiences of my career, driving from Vancouver to Halifax and interviewing cannabis entrepreneurs to mark the first anniversary of legalization. And my stop in Moncton was by far the most awe-striking. That facility, and this was 2019. I haven't had a chance to be back since then. I can't imagine the, HAL level supercomputers you guys have installed since then. But it's a really fun place to check out if you ever have an opportunity. I highly recommend it. And I don't know, I'm sure there's other stuff to do in Moncton too. But on the subject of, that's the one thing I would go there and go check out that. It is legitimately very cool, and I will expect that crypto transfer after. This is an audience question that I want to pose to you. It's directly related to all the sort of regulatory international trade stuff we've been talking about, so I wanted to put it to you while I made sure we had enough time. Looking ahead 5 years, do you expect the international cannabis market to evolve into a globally integrated supply chain that is similar to tobacco, or into a series of unharmonized domestic markets like is the case today?
Honestly, I think I'm not exactly sure. I think it'll be a mix.
Yeah.
I think you will get within, even within the EU, I think you'll get a mix. There will be EU law, there will be EU regulations, but the countries still will have slightly different regulations along the way. I'm hoping that as the industry goes, we can get more and more harmonization. Again, with some help from the Canadian government, because a lot of this is export. And testing sort of harmonization you can get. So you would like to get as much as you could. I think even within Europe today, you look at the way that the markets are going medical. There's a huge variation. Some have made it so restrictive that it's technically legal, but the chance of anyone who wants to access it, requires so many visits to the doctor, so many things that you will never. Actually have a sizable market, whereas Germany's taken a completely different tack where it is, you do need a prescription, but there's telemedicine, there's ways to access it, and for people to understand that legal cannabis is available, because in a lot of these markets, people don't even realize it. Mm-hmm. A funny thing that I learned in Germany is that it's one of the strangest things. The prices in the illegal market are double the legal market.
Really?
And it's because people who use cannabis for medical or other reasons, they don't know that it's possible to do this. And it's so there's it's a very strange. I've never seen that anywhere in the world where the illegal stuff is more expensive and people seek it out, but it's just because they don't know. But yeah, again, the main point of the question originally was, look, it will vary. I think you'll get pockets that are very similar. But in EU, you may eventually get a little more harmonization. But these sorts of things tend to be quite local when it's especially with health authorities involved.
Yeah. What level of harmonization do you think is feasible? Doesn't necessarily have to be the 5-year time horizon, but
yeah, it's very different. You can say anything you want, but these are governments, right? So. It'll always sort of go to a little bit of local politics, I think, as you go forward. I think in Europe, for example, I think you will have Germany as one of the leading voices. You'll have Switzerland, which is not EU but influential in the market. You will have Poland, which is a sizable one as well. And then I think there'll be pockets, where you can probably get some harmonization, and they will eventually have companies as well, right? So there will be an interest in intra-European trade to harmonize. But would I say EU-wide? No, they can't agree on anything, right? I've lived that during my time there. They will never agree on everything, but you'll get pockets within the EU. I think in other parts of the world, they're going to be very fragmented. I mean. Australia, maybe Australia, New Zealand, but even them, they're taking very different tacks. So I think it'll be fairly fragmented for quite a while. Yeah.
So you recently had this op-ed that was arguing against the excise tax, of course, the primary sort of restraint on the industry, and also, have a whole other conversation about what the government is using that money for, which was supposed to be for, health and research and all the things that doesn't appear to be happening. Yeah. But how important is that one thing, getting rid of it or diminishing it in some way? What changes there? Is it primarily just going to adjust the domestic competitiveness of cannabis, or is there a broader implication?
Well, I think excise tax is a reality that I think industries like ours have to accept. There's a good national interest in having some, and it does raise funds. I think the problem is the way the system is set up was set up for what the industry was at legalization. The average price of a gram of flour was $10. Today it's $3, but the excise is still that $1. So what it's done effectively, it's made it difficult for then you had the price compression as well in the market. And what it's done, it's made it very difficult for even the responsible players to make enough money to be able to invest, right? So even for us to be able to invest a lot in Moncton, we don't, and I think it's about, it's not simply reduce it. I think it needs to be, there are probably systems or different excise that encourage different behaviors in the market as well. I've seen multiple versions of, partially flat, partially ad valorem. It changes behaviors in the marketing and can, balance off the need for government revenue with the need to be competitive. And the other thing you need to remember is when you have that flat, the more the prices go down, the more appealing illicit gets. 'Cause the legal players have to sell at a certain price.
Right.
The people who don't pay it can go well under. So that's probably the thing. You'll shrink the size of the industry if you don't fix it, because it'll go to illicit. And two, I think it just restricts the funds. And I think, the simpler thing from an excise point of view is really just, harmonizing the stamps. The cost of doing provincial stamps for everyone, I think at an industry level, probably costs the industry well north of $100 million.
Really?
Because you essentially have to do different products for every single market. You have to do.
You can't be a truly national.
Yeah,
company
and yet you have to,
way.
even basic things like packaging. You have to buy smaller portions, to different lots, and it's just complication for no reason. And the alcohol industry I was talking earlier. I mean, I thought it was a whole industry only had one stamp, but apparently Quebec does have something different. But it's been 40 years, since
give
they
it to
had
Quebec to.
And this is
have
not a revenue issue for the government either. It's just bureaucracy, right? So I think that would help all the companies as well. And I think the more we grow, the more corporate tax we pay, the more we'll export. And I think big picture, it's a benefit for Canada. And it's always just balancing the short-term revenue for the government and making sure we can do things in a responsible way. But it would enable not just Organigram, but our competitors as well within Canada to be able to export more. Because soon enough the non-Canadian legal market will be bigger than the Canadian market. Yeah.
So when I walked over here from the Globe Mail newsroom, it's about 2 kilometers. I counted 17 cannabis stores on my way here. When people see and hear about numbers like that, they think to themselves, how could there possibly still be an illicit market? You really, it's easier to get cannabis than it is to get milk in this country. And that's a whole other conversation. Sublime management, maybe they come back tomorrow for that. But what will it take ultimately, do you think, to really stamp out the illicit market? Is it excise reform? Is it regulatory reform? Because ultimately, and you just touched on this, it does seem to be a bit of an economic race to the bottom otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think Toronto and Ontario are somewhat of an outlier, right? There are more. Toronto.
This is the entire country. Sorry.
Toronto is heavily overserviced. Put it this way: the number of dispensaries you have in Toronto and Ontario is just far more. I mean, in a lot of the other provinces, it's only Crown Corp, so it's a different sort of situation, say in Quebec or other places where I think it's, quite frankly for us, it's much simpler to manage than the chaos you have in Ontario. And by the way, here, there's also an issue of enforcement as well. So a lot of these shops are not necessarily legal as well within Ontario. But to the bigger picture on, illicit, it's always a combination of, the excise and what the legal market has to charge, and the balance to illicit is always going to be, because they will always have the cost advantage of not paying taxes. So the more you go up, the more chance there's going to be a bigger illicit market. It's economics, right? And it happens in most industries. The second the legal one goes up so high, something happens in the illicit. So there is an excise lever to that. I think the other part is the other issue that's always difficult to do is enforcement, right? So it's all great to have a law against things, but unless it's enforced, it doesn't matter. And as I said, I'm not against regulation, but if you're going to have a regulation, you have to enforce it, or what you do is you penalize the players who play by the rules. Yeah,
that's a really good point. I do want to come back to that, but I also know we only have a few minutes, and there is this one very good question from the audience that I want to make sure we get to. It does go back to the European market. You were talking about how so much of this is local, and I know a big part of why you would want to make that German acquisition is because the German government looks favorably on domestic production, as most markets around the world do. So with that in mind, do you expect to see a lot of domestic production versus importation in the European market as it evolves over time? I find that really fascinating because it probably will be a mix, but my assumption would be it's going to be a lot of acquiring facilities in the markets you intend to serve, and then last mile it from there.
Yeah, you will. I mean, you will increasingly. I think you will have production in Europe. I mean, in Germany there are some advantages to doing it. I don't think it's going to. It's a pretty significant investment to do a EU GMP facility.
Yeah.
And to build it to the scale where you'll get a return. So I think you will start seeing some facilities. You already have facilities. You already have growers in Germany and Portugal. Other parts of Europe, and you'll continue to see a little bit of growth in that. I think the Canadian companies and the scale we can produce in still gives Canadian companies a big advantage in that. And who knows? Some of the Canadian companies could buy facilities there to sort of supplement the capacities, because there's a shortage right now if you're on when you look at medical grade. So I think you will get more and more growers in Europe, but I think the balance, if anything, I think it'll be Canadian companies buying there and a few startups that are
right. So it's still Canadian cannabis industry,
yeah.
even if it's this is pot that never touches Canadian soil.
Yeah, there's been a lot of deals recently. In Netherlands, I can't remember who bought one of the companies there, Chronos. You do have, we're not the only company. We weren't the first to invest in Germany either, right? You have almost all the big companies already have some presence there.
Yeah.
And then you have companies like Curaleaf that are present in a lot of the European markets. And I think there will always be some economic logic to some production locally, but I think at the scale you need, we're too far ahead. And like I said, it's not easy.
Yeah.
People think you're just growing a plant and you put it out. The one thing.
I mean, they call it weed.
Exactly. I think the thing everybody in the industry has found is it's not as easy to get it to a medical grade and to the standards in Europe.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. I think anybody, when they legalized the 4 plants that people could grow at home, I think that's when there was a mass realization that it's actually a lot harder than it looks. Last question, we have a couple minutes left. If Mark Carney owed you a favor, if you had some unflattering pictures of him, say, or something, what would you ask of him? What's the one thing, if the federal government could do one thing you asked, no questions asked, what would it be? For the industry, not you personally.
I'm trying to think what, there's a number of things. The thing that comes to mind obvious first is really around the excise reform, just to make it less punitive and to make sure there's a better future for the industry. That's the first one. The second thing I would think is just what I mentioned earlier, to change the frame of the industry from cannabis to a good Canadian world-leading industry that you should support. So, under that you get a lot of different policies, but I think if you just see, like I said, if you objectively looked at the number of the industry, there would be absolutely no reason why you would ever not support this industry. So put it in that frame, balance it against sort of the Health Canada concerns, and treat the industry differently and give the same support as any other industry that, generates that sort of benefit for the Canadian economy.
If only they knew there were more Canadians legally growing pot than building pickup trucks. Well, thank you, James. Okay. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
A big thank you to James and Jameson. You certainly gave us lots to think about, and Jameson, thank you for such lively questions. Thank you to all of you for taking a couple of hours out of your day today and joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Enjoy the afternoon.